Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partners with businesses, organisations, trade unions and social democratic parties across the globe to develop community organising strategies and train leaders to build power from within their constituency. And in 2021, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, inspire others, take action, give hope and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Socially Democratic is also presented to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Are you passionate about providing access to justice? Maurice Blackburn, Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, is looking for a senior associate to join their TAC and work injuries team on a full-time permanent basis based in either their Dandenong or Ringwood offices. You'll use your legal technical knowledge and expertise to strive for fair outcomes for Maurice Blackburn's clients. The role is based in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. And to apply, go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. Does anyone say / anymore? Do they just say forward careers? Anyway, go check it out and apply today. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that dives into the progressive campaigns and the issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And abroad we go once again this week. We are joined by Will Cubbison, who holds a PhD in political science and has a focus in political behaviour and an extensive experience in statistical analysis. He's an American independent researcher, but now based in Jerusalem, in the great state of Israel, and does a whole bunch of work on data analytics as well. And he used to be a field organiser too, so it's close to my heart. And we chat to Will today about how he sort of got involved in political campaigns in the United States. And then we kind of really go off topic, and I just junked all of my questions and just started talking about campaigns and field and data and analytics and research and experiments and all that kind of wonderful stuff that makes our campaigns far more effective and efficient. And then eventually we sort of talk about what's going on in Israel, both politically and in terms of their response to COVID. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode with Will. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, let us know by leaving us a review on either Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And for updates, don't forget to follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And I've got a bunch of emails from listeners over the last week or so that I have not got back to, and I do apologise for that. I will respond to your emails. Work's just been a bit flat out the last couple of weeks, but I will endeavour to respond to your emails, and I do appreciate you reaching out to us to ask us more about our guests that we've had on the show or some stuff related to organising and campaigns in general. So I appreciate that. And thank you for supporting the show as well. And great to hear from you. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Thursday afternoon in lockdown Melbourne, and joining me on the line is a man who holds a PhD in political science with a focus on political behaviour and has extensive experience in statistical analysis and experiments. He's now an independent researcher based in Jerusalem, Israel. Shalom, Will Cubbison, and welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thanks for having me.
Just when doing this podcast, you always have to read out the bios of people, and normally you kind of like jump on LinkedIn or something just to kind of get analysis, or even just ask the guest before they come on, like you and I just did moments ago. I had the weird experience of I'm normally reading out people's bios because of the podcast, and I had a weird experience the other day. I was asked to come and give a presentation for one of the universities to one of their postgrad classes, and the academic, who I don't know overly well, but obviously they did that. They went to my LinkedIn profile and just read out my bio verbatim, which I kind of cringed a bit, because when you write that, you're kind of writing it from you're trying to sell yourself, and then all of a sudden you're hearing this read out aloud, and you're like going, I feel like a bit of a wanker now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in there and I'm going to edit it so it says, so when they read it out next time, it'll be like, our next guest is a former trade union organiser with the Transport Workers Union, and he worked for the Australian Labor Party for a number of years, launching their grassroots campaign. And he's also the starting pitcher for the Boston Red Sox in Game 6 of the 2013 World Series. Would you please welcome to the stage Stephen Donnelly? Just to see if it gets in is my goal.
It can't hurt, right? I mean, just delete all that stuff before you eventually try to get a public position, because that ends poorly. But,
well, maybe it'll help. You never know. Diversifying in my roles and responsibilities. What I want to talk to you about today is a number of things. Obviously, you're in Israel at the moment, so I've got some questions about life in Israel through the pandemic and whatnot. And also, you've got a new unity government there, so I'm super interested in that. And I also obviously want to talk about analytics and stuff too. But even before that, I'd be keen to just sort of, you and I, when you were in Australia not that long ago, caught up and had a coffee and talked a lot about your pathway into politics, and I just thought that would be really cool to share with our audience. Mm-hmm. So talk us through where'd you grow up, and what were some of those moments of your childhood or teens that shaped your values and led you into sort of centre-left politics and the work that you do now?
So first, thanks for having me. Excited. So I grew up, actually lived in a few different places in America. We moved around a fair bit, and mostly grew up though in North Carolina. For where my interest in politics comes from, I don't remember this, obviously, but my mom tells the story of, as a very young kid, us going out for pizza one night and me just being transfixed by the news. And I think it was, I don't know, she says maybe like the Lockerbie bombing or something that. So I think I always had an interest in politics, and certainly had an uncle and great uncle who were involved in different ways and different things. I started to get into politics really in high school, and some volunteering stuff and some paid and unpaid internships in university. To explain a little bit, I think, about my view of center-left politics in general and where I come from is, so my mom and dad got divorced when I was 2. And I think a lot of my shaping and understanding of kind of the world in many ways comes from, I think, 2 things, which is that experience and understanding what it's like, what it was like for my mom as a single mom. And the other thing is, I grew up generally as the one of the only Jews that I knew in the South. And a lot of my friends were growing up because of the schools where I was living were African American. And I think that also really shaped a lot of who I am and how I think about politics, is that experience as often being literally the only Jew or the only one I knew about in a room. I think in my high school, there were 2,000 students, and there were fewer than 10 of us. And then having a lot of friends who are African American. And North Carolina certainly has been often more progressive than a lot of the rest of the American South, but it's still, racism is real and it exists, and it is a constant living thing. And so those experiences really shaped it. And then, so in university, I worked in politics for a few years. I was managing some campaigns. I did a lot of field organizing and a lot of what in American politics we call the real heart of political work, which is getting organizations and looking at endorsements, things like that. And then I kind of got tired of it and I needed a break. And I went back to university, did grad school, and it turns out the bug didn't go anywhere. So I then started doing some other work here and there while I was in school, got my PhD in political science, and now I'm doing all sorts of other analytics and research. And that's a good starting point. We'll start there.
It is an excellent starting point, and I'm going to pick a lot of that apart in a moment. But starting with those experiences as a young Jewish boy growing up in the South, what were those experiences like?
It is really interesting. I mean, so my dad's not Jewish, and there's times when I think people it's funny, friends say that there's doppelgangers all throughout Israel that look like me, but often I would, in the South, I can do this thing that I think most people refer to as passing. And so I lived with my dad for a year in sixth and seventh grade. And I had a kid in school. I went to a public school, and this was very rural Tennessee. Asked me if I wanted to be a member of the KKK because his dad was, and he was proud of this fact. And, you have those sorts of things which are not the outright anti-Semitism that some of my friends experienced. But certainly you often felt you were apart, you were other, you were something different. And I had a teacher once who in high school who bragged about her son and his friends going to some other country, being Christian missionaries, and not telling anyone the government didn't allow Christian missionaries in. So they had to do it underhandedly. And she was very proud of them, and having this experience of being just very separated from that experience, and kind of feeling like it was a very othering moment. Like I said, I didn't experience the level of anti-Semitism that a lot of, I think, friends did or other people have in their lives. Nothing so explicit towards me, but certainly you didn't often feel like you were part of the majority. And I think that definitely informed a lot of, who I am now.
And you said you had a lot of friends who are African American. Was there kind of like a kinship there as both being, I guess, minorities within this community, this broader white community of North Carolina and the South in particular?
A little bit. I mean, obviously, North Carolina, certainly all of my friends are also heavily Christian. So in that environment, it's not like you fit. But I think some of that was it. And some of it was, I don't know, I just, I grew up with this idea that, people are people and deserve to be treated as such. And so it was never, I mean, there's certainly some people, there's parents who, if, a kid brings someone home from school as a friend that is not of the same race, will react. And I never experienced that. And so that sort of also informed the idea that you can be friends with anyone, treat them like a person. And that was an really important value. So
you talked about getting involved in campaign politics, and you chose field. There's a lot of current and former field organisers that listen to this show, so they'll be keen to hear of your experiences. Where did you first start? Where did you first start organising?
Yeah, so my first real experience was 2006. I was still in university, and I took time off, and I was managing a state Senate campaign in North Carolina. And I had a falling out with the candidate, and I ended up leaving the campaign.
Okay, why did you fall out with the candidate? That question must be asked right now.
It is a long story. I won't go all into, but protecting the innocent. I'll simply say I was 20, turning 21. The candidate was not a very good candidate. There were a lot of personality conflicts. So yeah, it just, and he ended up losing 56-43 or something. And one of these campaigns where he put a lot of his own money into it. And that's, it's hard to take direction from a 20-year-old when you put a lot of your own money into a campaign. So it led to a lot of strife. So I left, and there was a few different options and opportunities. And I had met some people, and there was this guy running for Congress, and they needed some help in field. And he was running a shoestring budget. I mean, when I walked in, literally every day, the campaign manager would write a check for all the donations that had come in that day to the television, to the media buyer. And the campaign account would drop to zero. And so they said to me, if we win, you'll get paid this amount. If we lose, no promises. And there was the final 6 weeks. This was 2006. Democrats were attempting to take back the House, the U.S. House. And I just did it. I just jumped on board. I moved to Charlotte, North Carolina for about 6 weeks and these are the days before targeting. So we were literally, it was a 65% Democratic precincts mostly. And we were just trying to get everyone to vote that we possibly could. And we worked our tails off. He ended up losing by, I don't remember the exact margin. It was fewer than 350 votes.
Ouch.
Which was a real shame. Although then 2 years later, he won by 10 points. So that was pretty good. But, this was a guy, he was like shoestring budget. He was a former manager of a textile mill, former, not like a low-level manager. He was a former high school studies teacher after the social studies after the plant that he worked in had been shut down because of, frankly, some really bad trade deals. And so it was an amazing campaign. Even though we lost, I should say, to her benefit, the campaign manager ended up giving me a paycheck about 6 months later. So I was treated very well in that experience, actually.
Better late than never. And so obviously from that experience, did that give you the hunger then to do more organizing? And where did you take your skills and resources then?
Yeah, I was told that field didn't do anything, and it wasn't worth the time and energy. It's only worth maybe 1 point. So what was the reason to do it? I did some other work, and then 2007, 2008, and then in 2008, I had the opportunity to go work for the Service Employees International Union, which is a very aggressive union. They started in a few different ways. They're most well known in the U.S., organizing a lot of healthcare workers in New York and some other places. And it's one of the most diverse unions, has a real aggressive organizing strategy. So I went and was sent to Reno, Nevada, for about 6 months. And we had at first a team of about 5 union members who'd flown in from New York. They spent 6 months living in Reno, trying to get people to vote for Obama. And then we ended up, by the end of the campaign, I think we had 25 paid organizers and a few campus volunteers doing a lot of voter registration and persuasion in really, really rural Nevada. And I loved it. It was really incredible. I think one of the best days of that campaign was some union members from Oakland, California, took a bus in. Oakland and Sacramento, they took a bus 4, 5, 6 hours, 200 people on buses. And if you've ever been or heard of Reno, Nevada, it's not a very big city. And we were focused on the rural counties around it, places where there's a town of 2,000 and 5,000. And so it was our job to figure out how to send these 200 people all across this whole big area in a meaningful way, doing final days GOTV. It was really incredible, actually. It was just a great experience. And, Obama won Nevada and became president, and it was a really good day. It was a very good day.
It's something that I think that a lot of Australian Labor Party campaigners and volunteers should at least experience once in their lifetime, is to be a part of the get out the vote part of the campaign, those final days of turnout, and can you sort of give us an experience or shed some light on what that experience looks like, the enormity of the numbers, the processing, the data management that takes place, the goals, what does this look like?
It's a huge process. I mean, so a good example in Nevada, even as early as 2008, they had early voting. So in person, you could vote the final 2 to 3 weeks of the campaign, and then you could, alternatively, for the actual day of the election, you could do a mail ballot or just go to a normal polling place. But it's rural Nevada, so there's often, as I said, you have these very small towns. And so what you would have is the state would set up polling places that would be, let's say, town hall or a shopping center or a grocery store. And it would only be open in that town for, let's say, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. on Tuesday. And then next Wednesday, the same town would have a polling place. And that was it for their early voting. That was the extent of it. And so a lot of our work in those final days was trying to match the work that we're doing in the organizers and placing door knockers in those towns in the right moments in those final few days. So there's a lot of, you don't want to, and you're sending people to 2 or 3 different places. You don't want to send them with the wrong information about where to vote. Mm-hmm. You don't want to tell someone, for instance, who lives in, I don't know, West Melbourne, that their voting place is somewhere in East Melbourne. That just doesn't work. So, that's the sort of work that we're doing. And the scale of the data. So in North Carolina, this is my best experience, or the most experience. There's about 2 weeks of early voting, and every day the state gets a list of people who voted. And so what you're doing every day in the final 2 to 3 weeks is taking a list of supporters, matching it against the voter file, and removing people who have voted, and then trying to always constantly only be speaking to people who have not voted yet. And you're doing the same thing with your target universe. So if you, for instance, have a list of, I don't know, 10,000 people who you think, if I tell them to vote, they're going to vote. But if I don't, they're going to stay home. Mm. And so every day you're trying to contact them in a different form, on a rolling basis, while removing the people who actually vote and not be annoying. It is a just constant logistical challenge that takes a lot of time and energy and people working behind the scenes. It's a pretty cool effort, actually.
It is. Yeah. It actually is. I when I was over in 2016 for the Hillary campaign, it must have been like 2 or 3 days before the election. And I was in Philadelphia. I think it was in South Philly. And obviously Philadelphia for that election, it's on the day voting. There is no early voting. I don't know if that's still the case now, but it wasn't. Certainly you could only vote on that particular, on the Tuesday.
It changed it during Corona, but otherwise, that's generally the rule.
I had a thing in the back of my head that suggested that it may have changed, which was unique. And so I went to a field office, which was basically a theatre without sans the chair. There was no chairs. There was this big stage and this really garish carpet, like a community theatre. Huge big swing doors. You sort of walked in, and all out the front it was just decorated as the sort of Hillary for America stuff out the front, handmade signs, all that kind of shit. And we sort of walked in, and as I walked in, a busload of volunteers had arrived from somewhere else. So I was stuck at the back of this queue, and we sort of got processed as we walked in, signed in, and then they kind of brought us into different groups, had to wait in this waiting area, then moved down the back. Oh, they got our walk packets, then got moved to the back of the room to a small group of like 15. We all got trained, and then got kind of let out a side door, and then off we went. And I went to a part of Philly, which was basically, I walked, the houses are so small, and it was a small block, really. I don't know how much would be in that walk packet, but I knocked that off in 2 hours. But I was knocking on doors where clearly someone had already been before, because we were leaving these sort of Hillary stickers on the door saying we've come, but we're coming back, kind of thing. And some of the houses that had been 3 or 4 stickers been placed, like no one, clearly people weren't home. And as I'm doing that, on the other side of the street is someone else who was in my training group doing their block. It was just an fascinating kind of, and then I came back in, I dropped my packet off, and you could see a whole bunch of people there just grabbing the walk packs and entering the data and updating whoever I spoke to, and obviously amending those lists and then redoing it. And then that pack got sent back over to another group, and I got sent back to another crew, got a new walk pack, and out I went again. It was just a great day, but also I was fascinated to watch the process upon which, they were cycling through thousands of volunteers to come through and, get out the vote.
It's a really amazing thing. I mean, I think I have lots of questions about the effectiveness in terms of how we could be doing it better or different, or, and there's a certain, I think actually, especially after the 2008 campaign, after Obama won, there's been a real, for lack of a better word, fetishization of this idea of like, oh, if we just get 10 more volunteers, we'll win the election, which I think is a little overselling things. But the scale of the conversations we're able to have in America in the final few days of a big election, it's it's an incredible operation to watch. It's really, really special. And especially, I think when you think about the fact that that theater was probably empty 2 months before that, and will be empty again the day after election or 2 days later. And it's just, it's incredible to watch. It's really special. People absolutely, I think, should take the time and go and see it in person. And when you think about every single one of those volunteers was having a conversation with a potential voter and trying to convince them to take part in a democracy, it's a pretty beautiful thing.
Yeah, and I think actually having an Australian accent created some sort of intrigue by the people. For this folks at home here in Australia, the people I was door knocking were Democrats, so we're trying to turn out the base, right? So it was a friendly conversation. It wasn't kind of like in Australia we have to do persuasion. That's a completely different. That's a different ball game, right?
Very, very different.
Yeah. But it was intriguing. Just the scripts that had been developed were based on this obviously experiments that had that had been testing how to remind folks to go vote. Like, where have you got a plan?
Yeah.
What insights do you have in on that? Your eyes are lighting up now as I say that. So I'm not going to explain it. I'm going to let you do that.
So one of the parts of my resume I left out a little bit. So in 2016 and 2017, I worked for this organization called the Analyst Institute. And to give people background who may not have heard of it, the Analyst Institute was started actually after the 2004 election, when George Bush beat John Kerry for president. There was a small group of people, mostly a guy within the AFL-CIO, Mike Podhorzer, some other folks within environmental groups, and some other unions, and I think Planned Parenthood may have been involved. And the basic thought process was, we lost, but we learned a lot. Let's figure out how to not lose again. And so initially it was just kind of this organization to share research and data and analytic insights. And eventually it became a professional organization. And the Analyst Institute now, the last time I checked, has conducted something in the range of 600 get out the vote experiments and another 200 or 300 persuasion experiments in American politics, trying to change people's minds about who they're voting for, get people to vote for someone different. There's even been some activist training experiments. Anyway, so I work for them, and this is what they do, is you think about these sorts of things and test things 5, 10, 20 times to see how they work. And it's a lot of social and political psychology, behavior research. It's really trying to think about how can we use science to improve the work that we do. One of the really good insights that I had that was told to me early on is, if you care about politics, you're not normal. And if you're the type of person to give up your entire weekend to go to a training about how to talk about politics, you're not a normal person.
Hey. Just steady on.
But the people we're trying to convince, they're normal. They have regular lives. Maybe they care about politics in the final few days of an election. They've got, frankly, better things to do. And often, sometimes in American politics, the people you're trying to convince are like the most tuned out, the most disinterested in politics people you've ever met. And that creates a real problem, right? Because the things that type of person cares about and the things that we care about as people who care about politics are different. And so what we really need to do is understand that regular person. And that doesn't mean necessarily just polling or, oh, I care about politics and they don't because they care about these other things. It's often also, we need to understand, how do we change behavior? There's a very good paper that I love and it's the basic title is something along the lines of voting is a habit. And it's a sort of idea that some of these things are habitual behaviors we get used to. I vote because I was taught to vote early on, and it's a very important thing in my family. And my mom has never, as far as I know, my mom hasn't missed an election in 30 some years, maybe even longer. And not everyone has that sort of behavior. And how can we change what people are doing in their lives? And anyone who's ever tried to break a habit knows that it's hard. So this habit of, let's say, voting for one party or not voting, it's really difficult work. And the science behind how we change that is, it's an obsession for me. So.
And so to the point, I mean, it was interesting to see the script or the talking points or the guide we were given in terms of the conversation to get the voter to, in their own mind, create a plan upon which how they were going to go vote was interesting.
Yeah, the insights, there's been some cool ones. I mean, some of the most effective ways of getting people to vote is, so in America, there's a voter file, which is public, and it's a list of, or mostly public, which is a list of everyone and whether or not they voted in different elections. And so came from academics, been used extensively now in campaigns called social pressure, where you tell people this is public and your neighbors will know whether or not you voted. And we're going to remind them that you didn't vote, but they voted. And you can do that in happier, nicer, or meaner ways. That's been really effective. This plan making, I think, is one of my favorites, right? Because, in America, Election Day is not a holiday. People have to work. People still have to send kids to school. Or if they're not sending kids to school, then because the school's a voting place and it's closed, they've got to figure out what to do with the kids. It's difficult sometimes for people to find the time to vote, especially, I think, a lot of classic Democratic voters, like shift workers. It's really hard sometimes to find space in your calendar to go sit in a line for 45 minutes or an hour to vote. So yeah, getting people to think through that day and plan voting into their calendar. It's been really, really insightful. And I think one of the things that I find intriguing is the lack of experiments for an Australian audience. In America, we're obsessed with getting out the vote because it's difficult. There's a lot of people who aren't registered. Turnout is often 30, 40, 60%. So in a place where there's 100% turnout, or I was actually, if you saw the most recent German election, 78% turnout, getting out the vote is a very different, it's not so important when almost everyone votes anyway. So, or everyone has to vote by law. So it's we'll see.
Look, it's something that I know that in by-elections here in Australia, at a state or a federal level, the turnout does drop off. Not still high numbers, like still low 90%, or maybe sometimes it could drop below 90 to be sort of 85 or whatever. But when the margins are so tight in a marginal seat, where a candidate can win or lose by, 2,000 or 3,000 votes, those votes add up. And it's something that we certainly have, the Labor Party, when I was working for the party, had trialled. Didn't run any experiments, unfortunately, to test the effect of it. Or actually, as I say that out loud, I think that we may have done it in another state with some experiments about reminding people about if you don't vote, you'll get fined, and just seeing the effect from that reminder as a means to motivate folks was one thing that we've done mostly through social media communication. But we did, after the 2016 experience in the US, I took all of the materials with me and brought them back home to Australia, and we sort of adopted that for a couple of by-elections we had here in my home state, where we actually, on the final day, or the last 2 days, we stopped persuasion. Oh, no, we still had some persuasion phone banks going, but we then moved to targeting Labor voters that we thought would be less likely to turn out, so younger Labor supporters, and actually had that conversation with them. No experience, but anecdotally, the report backs from our volunteers were, a lot of people were saying that's super helpful because we were giving them materials that showed them the closest polling centre to go vote, the times, and we verbally spoke to them about making a plan. And people were coming back and saying, I'm waiting for my husband to come home to grab the kids, so then I will go vote. So people were starting to make a plan. So certainly it's
beautiful to see. Yeah.
Oh, it really was.
It's also, I mean, I think it's interesting. This is also one of the things, because we're so invested in politics, we have often we say other people are disinterested in a judgmental way. But it's true, right? Like, if you've got two kids at home and the partner's at work, like, you can't just necessarily pick up and go spend 30 minutes in line, especially if you're not convinced that that election is going to have any impact on your life going forward. And so convincing people that it will have an effect, but then also giving them the tools to really, like you said, where to vote is often, I mean, I don't know what it's like in Australia, but in some places, figuring out where to vote is actually kind of an annoying process. So if we can lower the cost of it, it's a really vital work. It's really essential.
We're not getting completely off topic here, but I'm enjoying this conversation. So I do want to ask you in a moment about what was your gateway drug into doing sort of research and data analytics and all that kind of stuff. But while we're just talking about, you mentioned persuasion and some of the experiments that the Analytics Institute has done in terms of persuasion in the United States, which is interesting because, as you've said in your own remarks, that most of the focus is on turnout. What has, and I've read a bunch of them myself, but I'm interested to get your insights into some of the research that has come out of testing persuasion-based conversations.
So one of the things that I think there's two core findings. The first is persuasion is difficult, especially in the American context. And I think also in a context like, let's say the UK or Australia, where you mostly have two major parties that are soaking up 80, 90% of the vote. Getting people to change sides is very difficult. And there's two researchers who I think it was early 2017, published a paper about this. It was David Brookman and Josh Kalla, Kalla, and I don't remember how to spell David's last name, but they analyzed something like 50 different experiments, and the average effect was zero, pretty much. So it's very hard. And one of the things, the two things we just talked about for getting out the vote, those as tactics only showed up 20 years ago, 10 years ago, not even 10 years ago, actually, for plan making. And persuasion hasn't had the same creative experimentation, because that's what we spend a lot of time doing, but it really needs to rethink. But one of the more interesting insights from the Analyst Institute that we found is this idea that to persuade, you need to give people new and different information. A good example, I ran an experiment with the Analyst Institute in 2016. We're trying to get people to vote for Hillary over Trump. One of the things that we found was that a positive message worked better. And maybe that's because people like positive messages. I'm not sure that's actually the case. But the real reason is that everything people were hearing was negative. Trump is terrible. He does this. He does that. Hillary's evil. She's corrupt, yada, yada. Emails. So when people actually heard a positive message about Hillary and heard something about her background, it was new and different. And because it was new and different, it broke through. People paid attention, and we were able to move some votes towards her. Obviously, that lesson didn't get out to the people it needed to in time, and it didn't work. But and FBI director sent a letter, and anyway, so yeah.
You mentioned the research that Josh Kalla and Brockman conducted. I note that they had done, I don't know if this is a part of the same working paper that they worked on, but they also have done a study which was testing which narrative strategies durably reduce prejudice.
Yes.
And the key takeaway from that was listening to a canvasser share their personal experiences changed the participants' attitude towards, I think it was immigrants that they were doing it on from memory.
They've tried a few different ones with transgender rights, immigration, and abortion. Actually, I think at different times they've tested all three.
Right, and then there was another one by, I think it was Emily Cubbison from memory, that also did an experiment where their personal experiences, sort of bridged the moral and political divide better than facts.
Yeah, when I first got into campaigns and first into field, there was this idea that if you spent more than 30 seconds to a minute at the door, you were wasting your time and the voters' time. And like literally, I think our scripts early on were like, who are you voting for? And if it was our guy, it was, great, do you want to volunteer? If not, please show up and vote. And if they're voting for somebody else, or they were undecided, it was, please vote for our guy, bye. And that was the end of the conversation. And there's been this, as we've realized that actually persuasion is very difficult, there've been a lot of experiments in the last 5 years or so about, can we change people's mind if we have a 5 or a 10-minute conversation, and what shape could that conversation take? As I said, the people who volunteer are different. For instance, if you're campaigning for LGBT rights and, I don't know, half of your volunteers are members of the LGBT community and half of the volunteers are people who have close friends or family who are LGBT. The average population is, it's not 50% LGBT, right? And there are people who literally don't know that they know anyone who is gay. And so sharing those conversations, it's a really interesting idea. I mean, I think doing it, I imagine it's much harder to find people who have zero, labor voting friends. So maybe that persuasion, that tactic may not work as well, but there's other ways that we can think about this sort of thing. And so, there's been a lot of experimentation in the last 5 years about this, what is often called deep canvassing, the 10-minute conversations. But it's a lot heavier. You can't do a bus full of people and train them in 30 seconds or in 5 minutes how to have these conversations. It's a very different conception of what field is. But it's an exciting change.
Yeah, and that was something that I noticed when I was in the States in comparing that back home, because sometimes you often think of the United States as being the gold standard of political campaigning, and in so many ways it really is. It's but no one's perfect, right? And we live in Australia. We live in an environment where we have to persuade people to get them to vote for our political party or our candidate. And I can only speak really of the Victorian experience here in my home state with the field program, but over the journey since 2013, we've invested considerable amount of time and resources in training our organisers to then train our volunteers in incorporating public narrative into our persuasion-based conversation, crafting their own public narrative or crafting their own story of self and the story of us and the story of now into both our volunteer recruitment conversations, but also then eventually our persuasion conversations when we move to that win the vote phase. And, you're right. That takes time. That means you've got to sit down with volunteers and train them for the first time anyway, train them for 45 minutes on public narrative, and for them to consider moments in their life about who they are, why they have those values. But the payoff is when they go and knock on those doors, or when they have those conversations on the telephone, it's a truly meaningful conversation with someone that you've never met before. And to ask those questions of the person you're speaking with in a genuine way, it stops being transactional and it actually becomes transformational, and actually strengthens our democracy and helps us win elections at the same time.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's one of the things, actually, it's funny you said America's the gold standard. There's two things. First of all, money buys you a lot, and there's more money in American politics than anywhere else. But there's an arrogance that comes with that is, well, I don't have to tell someone else, not from America. It's off-putting. But in politics, the issue that it creates is there's two things. First, Americans can learn a lot from what's happening in these types of conversations in the sort of 45-minute training session. Most campaigns in America are not doing that, and they need to be. They really need to be. But the other side of that is there's an entire world of politics that has to learn some other tactics and techniques. I mean, I've been spending a lot of time recently, obviously here in Israel, and also some time in Europe. And an election where there is first past the post, all you need is a plurality. You need 48, 49, 51% to win, and it's a Democrat versus Republican, that's it. Versus a system where there are 10, 12, 30 parties for a voter to choose from. It's an entirely different conversation. It's an entirely different mindset, sets of values. There's a lot to learn about the rest of the world. And Americans have a habit of assuming that everyone else is just like them and imposing their methods. And it often really just doesn't work. So yeah, you have to adapt. You have to change.
I do want to ask you questions about Europe in a moment, but before we move to the other side of the world, talk to me about. I've always been interested in identifying or finding experimental research that is comparing the return on investment in things like broadcast media advertising against other forms of campaign communication. I remember years ago I used to wheel out this study that was done by, I think it was the University of California, Berkeley or something, that tested the impact of TV advertising, but looking at it more of as a dollar value, like the more money you put in over time, the return doesn't reflect that investment. It actually just dissipates. That was the only research or experiments that I've seen. I know it's very difficult to kind of run experiments in a broadcast environment, but what's your insights into that?
Yeah, so I mean, you can do it actually with like zip code targeting and media markets, and anyway, but the Analyst Institute spent a lot of time and money on this, what they call VPK, which is votes per $1,000. So if you spend $1,000, how many votes can you change? And trying to do exactly what you're talking about. And I don't have those memorized, and any of your listeners who are actively working and engaged in progressive politics should join the Analyst Institute and read some of their research on this. But one of the insights is that different things take different amounts of time and money, right? So, we often think of television as being this like big giant thing. You're spending all sorts of money on it, but it's also reaching a lot of people. In field, like you're saying, that 45-minute conversation, you're having to pay an organizer for that entire 45 minutes. And often to get those people in the door and get them work afterwards. And so, I think a lot of it is that some of our most effective methods of speaking to voters are actually also the most expensive on a vote per $1,000 measurement. And I think one of the insights that's been really cool from the Analyst Institute is when we're thinking about campaign budgets, it's spreading out our work and making sure that we're efficiently speaking to as many people as we possibly can. And that budget work, I think, is still something that needs a lot more time and energy and insight. And I spent a lot of time when I was at the Analyst Institute trying to have these conversations with people. And there's a lot of work still left to do on how do we budget effectively.
Yeah, I think it's a tough question for any campaign director or at a state or a national level, particularly because since the beginning of TV advertising, it's become like a drug. We just pump so much money into it. And I've seen various other budgets increase and decrease over time, but the one that's always constant is our TV ad buy. And it's, common sense says to you, when you talk to your family and friends about how they consume information, how are they watching television today? the numbers are, and the numbers bear out. Fewer people are seeing TV advertising through, in Australia, all the different sort of streaming services that we have here.
And they're skipping ads, and and there's a lot of movement online, and you have to figure out how to do digital ads. And I actually just had a long conversation, in Europe with GDPR and these privacy protections, your ability to do online ads is greatly reduced. And it's a constantly evolving thing. When I first got involved in politics, someone told me that the way you do a campaign is you pick a medium. In this case, it was direct mail, so sending flyers to people's houses, and you dominate it. And that's how you win an election. And in fact, the research has shown that you really can't. You literally have to be everywhere, because the voters are everywhere, and you don't know. There are people who are convinced by television ads, and there are people who aren't. And you don't know in general who those people are. If I just have a list of 1,000 voters, I can't tell you who's convinced by TV ads and who needs a door knock. And so you have to try all of them with as many people as possible. And it's that insight from the Analyst Institute especially has been really revolutionary in my thinking of campaigns.
You've mentioned GDPR. Let's talk about Europe. What's been your experiences as a researcher and working with progressives and broadly speaking, social democratic organisations in Europe, and their embracing of data and analytics? And you may actually just need to explain to our non-European audience what GDPR is as well.
So GDPR is a thing passed by the EU that protects the privacy of any European citizen's data, regardless of where the company is in any shape or form. So if you've ever been online and this annoying pop-up says, do you want to accept cookies? Yes or no? That's because of GDPR. And so in digital advertising in campaigns, a lot of our work relies on knowing something about those voters, right? So you can imagine, everyone's used to this, right? You go and you look at something on a website and you don't buy it. And then for the next 3 days, you see ads every time you use the internet for that product that you looked at and you didn't get yet. So politics uses that same technology, obviously, to try and find our people or the persuadable people, and so GDPR just makes things much, much more complicated. We could talk about that for an hour, but one of my experiences in Italy, in Europe, is, so I've worked now for off and on the last 2 years in Israel, some time in Italy. I've had an opportunity to have some conversations with people in other places like Germany and the UK. And there is a huge gap across Europe between the use of data. In Italy, the concept of a win number, like literally knowing how many votes you need to win to win the election, is relatively new, not really used. Most polls that I've seen in Italy are like, who are you voting for? And that's the extent of the survey. It doesn't include message testing or anything. Whereas then you get to places like the UK, or I've heard from friends, northern parts of Northern Europe, like Sweden, where there's very sophisticated data analysis going on. And I know there's experimentation happening in the UK. And you've got high level clustering and modeling and MRP in some places and not others. And it's a huge spectrum, really, of the level of data use.
Let's turn to the great state of Israel, and starting off with the election of this new unity government. It's remarkable that you can have a government that includes Naftali Bennett from the right party Yamina, that also then includes the Arab list members and everything in between, including our social democratic brothers and sisters in both Labor and Maretz. How is it faring since June?
It is better than expected, I think is the best answer I can give you. So look, it was messy to start. They just barely got in. It's a mess ideologically, internally, right? I describe Israeli politics as it's not one dimensional like in most countries. It's three dimensional here between, whether you call it security or Jewish Arab relations or whatever. That's an axis of politics. Then you've got the standard left right economic policies, which is not necessarily a big thing in campaigns, but it's a big thing internally in how government budgets get passed or not. And then you've got religion and that secular to ultra religious that is an entire it's a whole nother dimension. So it's very complicated. And this new government, I think we have I don't know, 6 or 7 parties or lists and factions and another 4 or 5 parties on top of that, because some of the factions are different parties and collections of people. It's been going actually pretty well. The opposition, led by former Prime Minister Netanyahu and Likud, has done everything in their power to stop the government from functioning. So, for instance, to function, the Knesset, just like any other parliament, has committees. Those committees were formed in Israel more than a month late, because Likud refused to, the entire opposition refused to participate in the number of people on the committee from each party, and now they're not naming people to the opposition committees, and it's a whole thing. The good news is that there are a lot of problems in Israel that bypass some of those more traditional issues. We have I actually just read a newspaper article yesterday. Housing prices have almost doubled in the last 10 years in Israel. In some cities like Tel Aviv, it's more like triple in the last 10 years. And, that sort of thing, that's an outside of a partisan politics thing that affects everybody. There's lots of, and Corona's really hurt the healthcare, our healthcare sector, which was already struggling with budget cuts before. So my hope is that they pass a budget, and if they pass the budget in the next month or so, then we'll have a budget for the first time in 3 years, which would be very exciting. We'll have, after that budget's passed in another year and a half, we'll have a center-left prime minister for the first time in forever. There are still some actually like really exciting things, and the budget has some stuff that's necessary, some new universities being built and significant expansion in hospital funding. So it's messy, but it's a lot better than I thought it could be, actually. So I'm excited.
If there was ever a moment to show the world that Israel, is a rainbow nation of diverse political opinions living side by side in a pluralist liberal democracy, this is the moment, right? I mean, I think I don't think it's talked about enough, the fact that, you have Jews and Arabs in the same coalition. You have left and right. All of those intersectionalities that you just spoke about, I think are all represented, aren't they, in this coalition government? Is that right?
In both, there are both Arabs and Jews in the coalition, Arab and Jews in the opposition. There is actually, we have a number of gay men, both in the coalition and outside the coalition. There is, if one of the members is going for a bigger appointment somewhere else, a different government position, if he gets that, there's an opportunity for the first out lesbian member of Knesset, which there was one member who just passed away who came out after she left the Knesset. But still, it's a whole gamut. I think one of the things that we can lose sight of is like Israel is still there's problems here, right? There's a lot of de facto discrimination. Arab workers have much lower levels of employment, and also they tend to get paid less and have jobs. But on the other hand, something like 40-50% of nurses are Arab, and that is it's a land of contradictions in the most exciting and interesting ways that I really love, but it's really hard to explain to people just how complicated it is. And we often, I think from the outside also, people look at it and they see Jews versus Arabs. Well, we have 1 million Jews who've come to Israel from the former Soviet Union, who grew up speaking Russian. Something like 55-60% of Jews in Israel themselves, their parents or their grandparents are grew up in Arab countries like Iraq, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, etc. And then amongst the Arab population, you have Druze, you have Arab Christians, you have Arab Muslims, which can also be split up into the Bedouin versus other Arab. It is an intensely complicated place to get everyone to not even to speak the same language. It's a difficult proposition. So, but it makes it exciting and interesting.
It does. I want to actually, how's your Hebrew?
It's pretty bad. My wife, I think, classic Australian fashion, would refer to it as shit. But it's I get by.
Good, very good. COVID in Israel.
Yeah.
There are moments there reading the news about the response of the Israeli government in addressing COVID. There's moments there where it seems like they are world leaders, and then there are moments where it seems like they're really struggling and battling. What's been talk to us about the strengths of the Israeli response to COVID and the weaknesses?
So early on in COVID, Israel was very aggressive with the lockdown, just like a lot of countries. And then we did this thing that also a lot of other, frankly, countries led by a certain type of prime minister. Netanyahu, Orban, Modi in India, some of the guys in the Czech Republic, they all have the same ideology and they did the same thing. They said, we won summer of 2020. We won. We beat COVID. That was it. And then the second wave hit, and then the third wave hit, and then Delta showed up. And it has often been a real struggle. Israel's had a lot of deaths. From September to about February or March last year, there was the second and third waves, which something like 5,000 Israelis died of COVID in that 6-month period, which for your listeners, the Israeli population is about 9 million people. So it's about the size of Victoria. So 10 times the death rate of Australia per capita, or some even worse than that, actually. But what we did is Israel has the benefit of, we have a very good healthcare system, and we have centralized electronic database of medical records. So we used that to convince Pfizer to give us doses, and Israel ended up giving out something along the lines of over 80% of our population was double vaccinated in fewer than 3 months between December and February of last year. February of 2020 and 2021. That's been incredible. In September, so about 6 weeks or so ago, maybe 8 weeks, Israel started offering booster shots because it's been more than 6 months. We ended up getting, the latest figure is 3.6 million. So that's a third of the country has received a third shot only within the last 6 weeks or so. So we have an incredible resource in our healthcare system, and it's been really incredible to watch it. On the other hand, people in hospital often don't have rooms, and they were in hallways, recuperating in hallways even before COVID hit. So the strain on our healthcare system the last decade has been, it's really bad. The budgets passed by Netanyahu did not fund the healthcare system properly, and we have a massively growing population. It's a problem. So yeah, but the other thing is that Israel's kind of gotten to this point now where with booster systems and such that we still have people dying. We still have a lot of people, and this last Delta wave was difficult, and I think there were a few moments where we were very close to a lockdown. And the healthcare system, I think, really got pushed to the edge, but we pulled it back with the booster shots. And The philosophy here has been, as long as the healthcare system can function and it's not under threat, people should be able to live their lives, which is a very different decision point than Australia has had, which is to say, we want to eliminate this. And that is, it's very interesting. Having spent 2 months in Australia and being in both places, they're very different decision points. I can make different arguments here and there, but in a vaccine world where we've got so many people vaccinated, I can understand. People wouldn't deal with a lockdown here. There's no way. You couldn't do it. Even the restrictions that we have where you have to prove you're vaccinated to get to certain, let's say a movie theater, it's accepted, but it's getting resistance. So
it's getting resistance in terms of rocking up to a movie theater and proving you're vaccinated, or?
Yeah, people are a little upset about it. I think especially now with the boosters, again, Netanyahu, after the vaccines, declared victory. And to be fair, we spent this entire summer where Israel was getting, I think, often 5, 10, 20 cases a day. There were fewer than 100 people in hospital. And then Delta came. And so this idea that we conquered it really took over. And then when Delta came and just showed people that if you're not vaccinated or the effects of that vaccine have expired, and people feel a little lied to, a little misled. And some people, and then, so speaking about this American disinformation and vaccine hesitancy, that politics has really infected Israel in some ways. So it's a lot of complicated things. On the other hand, like I said, 3.6 million people have gotten the booster shot only in the last 6 weeks. So it's not going so bad,
And that's the numbers that came out of Israel, certainly for the uptake of the first round of vaccinations, was incredible and incredibly impressive. And hearing stories of just the ease of access to get vaccinated. I think it was you was telling me that they even opened up the Rabin Square in Tel Aviv for people who.
Yeah, one of the hospitals had doses, and they were supposed to be giving people out. And the hospital said, instead of having people come to the hospital and just overwhelm us with people trying to get the vaccine, they literally, on their own initiative, hired an event firm, set up a bunch of tents in a public square in the middle of Tel Aviv, and just said anyone who's eligible within these age brackets. And then later it was literally anyone, including non-citizens, just come, just show up with any form of identification and you'll get a shot. And that's been the approach. I have a friend actually here who her parents live in the United States. She's lived here for about, 10, 15 years. Her parents got their doses very early on in America, January or February. It's now been more than 6 months. In America, they weren't yet eligible for boosters. They showed up in Israel. They're here for a month. They literally just went to the Jerusalem City Hall. There were tents outside. They showed their passports, and 2 minutes later, they had a booster shot. Because this thought process here in Israel is anyone who is in the country is a potential vector for corona, and they're a potential hospitalization and a potential death. So if we can get them the vaccine, we can save a life, we can save the healthcare system, do it. It doesn't matter if they're a citizen or not. If they're here, get a shot into their arms and save ourselves the worry, which is a really cool, exciting approach. But there's a lot of countries that aren't doing that or can't do that. So.
Oh, and I just know that Australians listening to this right now are going, the federal government still haven't even acquired boosters at all for our country. My nephew lives in New York, and he was bragging the other day saying he's about to get his booster shot, and some people in this country still haven't had their first. So it is incredibly frustrating. And the other story, this podcast is no friend of Bibi Netanyahu's, but the fact that apparently he got on the phone to the head of Pfizer and called the CEO at least 43 times in the first 24 hours to secure enough vaccines for the entire country suggests that, that's leadership there and actually getting off your ass and trying to,
It was a full court press here in Israel. One of the things I think that it didn't come out quite as much, but has been in the press has been one of the things that convinced the Pfizer board to do it was not just Netanyahu calling the CEO, but it was Ministry of Health officials calling the top scientists at Pfizer and saying, here's how we will get it into people's arms. Here's the data, the anonymous data that you'll get back that we can provide. And so a lot of the scientists actually convinced the board because they said, look, like, regardless of the politics of the press, doesn't matter. We need this data. And Israel was able to provide, I mean, the level of research here has been incredible. It's really exciting stuff. And yeah, it was a full court press. You had politicians and non-elected public health officials doing everything in their power to acquire enough vaccines for the country. And yeah, I think it's been very clear and obvious that in Australia, the approach by the federal government has been the opposite. So, yeah.
And that's actually a nice sort of way to end there, because you brought it back into data and analytics and experimentation, both in from politics and also in science and health as well. Will, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
I know we went a little bit over time and we kind of went off script a lot, but I really enjoyed catching up with you again. As we did when you were here in Australia in the middle of the year or whatever the hell it was. God knows, this year's turned into a bit of a blur.
It was the start of your winter. I missed a lot of summer, which it's okay. I was pretty happy to miss 40-degree days. So
it does get warm in Israel. That is true.
The 17 and slightly rainy Melbourne was actually a vast improvement over sweating to death. So
indeed, but we must get you on the show again, because there's so much else I want to talk to you about. But to say thank you very much. Thanks for coming on the show, and we wish you the best of luck with the work that you're doing both in Israel and throughout Europe.
Thanks so much, and look forward to talking again.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.